September 1969. Twickenham Film Studios in West London is cold, cavernous and uninviting. A converted aircraft hangar that feels more like a warehouse than a creative space. The Beatles have been filming what will become the Let It Be documentary, and tensions are running higher than they've ever been. Cameras capture everything. The uncomfortable silences, the passive-aggressive comments, the barely concealed resentment. But what the cameras don't capture is what happens after they stop rolling, when the four Beatles are left alone to confront the reality that their brotherhood is disintegrating. It's late afternoon on a Tuesday. The film crew has packed up for the day. George has already left, frustrated after another argument with Paul about how to play a guitar part. Ringo is in the corner, quietly packing his drum kit, trying to be invisible. Paul is at the piano, needlessly rearranging sheet music, avoiding eye contact with anyone. And John is sitting on an amplifier, smoking a cigarette, watching Paul with an expression that could be mistaken for boredom, but is actually fury. "We need to talk," John finally says. His voice is flat, emotionless. But there's an edge underneath that makes Paul's hands stop moving. Paul looks up, sees John's face, and knows what's coming. They've been dancing around this conversation for months, maybe years, but it's finally here. The reckoning. About what? Paul asks, though he knows. He's always known. He's felt the resentment building, seen the way John looks at him now compared to how he used to, noticed how their creative partnership has devolved into a silent competition where every song is a point scored, every suggestion a battle to be won. John takes a long drag on his cigarette, exhales slowly, deliberately. "About you ruining this band." The words hang in the air, harsh and unambiguous. Ringo stops what he's doing, frozen, unsure whether to leave or stay. Paul's face goes pale, then red. He opens his mouth to respond. But John holds up a hand. "Let me finish. I've been holding this in for too long, and I'm done being polite about it." John stands up, starts pacing, his movements agitated. "You've taken over, Paul, completely taken over. And you did it so gradually, so cleverly, that by the time the rest of us realized what was happening, it was already done. This isn't the Beatles anymore. This is Paul McCartney and his backing band. That's what we've become." Paul's jaw tightens. That's not fair. Someone had to take charge after Brian died. Someone had to organize us, get us working, keep us together. You certainly weren't going to do it. You were too busy with Yoko, with your avant-garde experiments, with everything except the band. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about," John says, his voice rising. "You think you're the only one who cares about the band. You think you're the savior, the one holding everything together. But what you're actually doing is suffocating us. Every session, it's your way or no way. Every arrangement has to meet your standards. Every song I write, you pick apart and try to remake in your image." John moves closer to Paul, his eyes intense behind his round glasses. "Remember Revolution? I wrote it as a raw, aggressive rock song. That's what I wanted, but you couldn't leave it alone. You had to suggest changes, modifications, a better way to do it. Same with Don't Let Me Down. Same with everything I write. Nothing is ever good enough as I've written it. It always needs the Paul McCartney polish." "Well, I don't want the polish. I want the rawness. I want the honesty." Paul stands up from the piano bench, defensive. "I'm trying to make the songs better. That's what we've always done. Collaborated, improved each other's work. That's the whole point of Lennon-McCartney. We challenge each other." "No," John says sharply. "What we used to do was collaborate. What we do now is you dictating and me accepting or fighting back. There's a difference. When we wrote In My Life or A Day in the Life, we were genuinely working together, building something neither of us could have created alone. But now you just want control. You want everything to sound like a Paul McCartney production." He continues, his frustration pouring out. Look at George. You've been doing the same thing to him, and it's worse because at least I can fight back. George suggests a guitar part, and you tell him he's wrong. George writes a brilliant song like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and you barely acknowledge it. You're so focused on your own material, your own vision, that you can't see how you're crushing everyone else's creativity. Paul's voice shakes when he responds. George left last month. He walked out because he said he was tired of being sidemen. But that wasn't about me. That was about all of us taking him for granted. It was absolutely about you, John fires back. George told me what you said during the session for Something. He played you what would become one of the best songs on Abbey Road, and your response was to suggest changes to the bridge, to question his chord choices, to treat him like a student who needed correction from the master. That's not collaboration, Paul. That's condescension. Ringo, still standing by his drums, finally speaks up quietly. John's got a point, Paul. Sometimes it does feel like you've already decided how everything should sound before we even start playing. And if we don't match that sound in your head, you get frustrated with us. Paul looks at Ringo, betrayed. Not you too. I thought at least you understood what I'm trying to do here. I understand, Ringo says carefully. But understanding doesn't mean I agree with how you're doing it. You're a brilliant musician, Paul. Nobody disputes that. But you've forgotten how to let other people contribute without filtering everything through your sensibility. John seizes on Ringo's words. Exactly. That's exactly it. You've stopped being a band member and started being a musical director. Everything has to be perfect according to your definition of perfect. But the Beatles were never about perfection. We were about 4 distinct personalities creating something unique together. Now we're just the Paul McCartney show, and the rest of us are session musicians hired to realize your vision. Paul's anger finally breaks through. This is bullshit. You want to know why I've taken charge? Because you stopped caring. After Brian died, you checked out emotionally. You met Yoko, and suddenly the band wasn't important anymore. Your attention was elsewhere. George was exploring Indian music and meditation. Ringo was doing films. Someone had to keep us working, keep us relevant. So I stepped up, and now you're angry at me for it. I'm angry because you steamrolled over everyone in the process, John says. Yeah, I was distracted. Yeah, I was dealing with my own stuff, but that didn't give you permission to hijack the band. You could have led without dominating. You could have organized without controlling every single creative decision. He points at Paul, his finger jabbing the air. The Sgt. Pepper sessions. That's when it started. That was your concept, your vision, and we all went along with it because it was brilliant. But something changed in you during that album. You got a taste of being the leader, the visionary, and you liked it too much. And ever since then, you've been treating the rest of us like employees rather than partners. Paul's voice is sharp with hurt. So Sgt. Pepper is my fault now. The album that everyone says is the greatest album ever made. The one that defined our generation. That's a bad thing because I was too involved. I'm not saying the album is bad, John says, forcing himself to speak more calmly. I'm saying that's when the balance shifted. Before Pepper, we were equals. Even with Brian managing us, we made decisions together. After Pepper, you started acting like you knew better than everyone else. And maybe you did know better about some things, but you couldn't distinguish between the times when your instincts were right and the times when you were just being controlling. John sits back down, suddenly looking exhausted. The India trip. That's when I really saw it clearly. We went to Rishikesh to meditate. To find some peace, to reconnect with ourselves. And what did you do? You got bored after a few weeks and left, and then you started pushing us to come back to London, to start another project, to keep working. You couldn't just let us have that experience without trying to manage our schedule. I wasn't trying to manage you, Paul protests. I just didn't connect with the meditation stuff the way you and George did. That doesn't make me controlling. It makes me different. But you couldn't accept that difference, John says. You couldn't let George and me have our spiritual journey without making us feel guilty for not being back in the studio. Even when we were thousands of miles away, trying to find some meaning beyond being Beatles, you were pressuring us to get back to work." He continues, his voice softer but no less intense. "And when we did get back and started working on the White Album, you were impossible. Every song had to meet your approval. Every take had to satisfy your standards. When I wanted to include Revolution 9, you fought me on it. When George wanted more songs on the album, you were reluctant. You only felt comfortable when your songs were front and center." Paul shakes his head vehemently. "That's not true. We all got equal representation on the White Album. Everyone got their songs included." "But at what cost?" John asks. "We recorded most of that album separately, with different producers, because we couldn't stand being in the same room together anymore. That's not a band. That's 4 solo artists who happen to share a name. And that's because you made it impossible to collaborate without fighting about every single decision." He stands up again, restless. "And now, with this Get Back project, or whatever we're calling it, this is supposed to be raw, live, stripped down. That was the whole concept, but you can't help yourself. You're already trying to perfect everything, to control the arrangements, to make it exactly how you envision it, rather than letting it be loose and spontaneous." Paul's frustration boils over. Because spontaneous doesn't mean sloppy. You want everything to be raw and unpolished, but I care about quality. I care about making sure what we release is actually good, not just honest or authentic or whatever other excuse you use for not putting in the work. "There it is," John says quietly. "Right there. That attitude. That I'm lazy because I don't want to do 15 takes of the same song. That George is wrong because he doesn't approach music the way you do. That your definition of good is the only definition that matters. That's why you're ruining this band, Paul. Not because you're too involved, but because you can't imagine a version of the Beatles that doesn't revolve around your aesthetic preferences." The room falls silent. Paul looks like he's been slapped. Ringo stands awkwardly, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. John lights another cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. "I never said you were lazy," Paul finally says, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just want us to be the best we can be." "No," John corrects him. "You want us to be the best according to your definition, and those aren't the same thing. My best might be rough around the edges. George's best might incorporate sounds and techniques you don't like. Ringo's best might be simpler than you think it should be. But you can't accept that. You need everything to conform to the Paul McCartney standard." He walks over to the piano, runs his hand along the keys without pressing them. "Remember when we were kids, writing songs in your living room? We were equals then. You'd have an idea, I'd have an idea, and we'd smash them together and create something new. Neither of us was in charge. We were partners, but somewhere along the way, you decided you needed to be the senior partner, and that killed the partnership." Paul's eyes are wet now, though he's fighting the tears. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to keep us together, keep us working, keep us relevant." "I know," John says, and there's genuine sadness in his voice. "That's the tragedy of it. Your intentions were good, but good intentions don't change the result. You've taken something that was a democracy and turned it into a benevolent dictatorship, and the rest of us are tired of being dictated to, no matter how benevolent it is." Ringo finally moves, walking over to stand between John and Paul. "This doesn't have to be the end," he says. "We can work this out. We can find a new balance." John looks at Ringo, then at Paul, and shakes his head. "I don't think we can. The balance is too far gone. Paul can't stop controlling everything. It's who he is now, and I can't keep pretending that's okay. Something's broken, and I don't know how to fix it." Paul wipes his eyes roughly. "So what are you saying? You want to quit?" John hesitates, then nods slowly. "Yeah, I think I do. Not today. Maybe not for a few months, but yeah, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I can't be in a band where my creativity is constantly being filtered through someone else's vision. I need to make music on my own terms, even if it means making it without you." The words hit Paul like a physical blow. He sinks back onto the piano bench, his face in his hands. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to drive you away." "I know," John says again, "but wanting and doing are different things. You wanted to save the Beatles, but what you actually did was smother them. There's a difference between leading and controlling, Paul, and you never learned where that line was." He picks up his jacket, preparing to leave. "For what it's worth, I don't hate you. Part of me still loves you like a brother, but I can't make music with you anymore, not like this. Not when every session feels like a fight for creative autonomy." Paul looks up at him, desperate. "We can change. I can change. Just tell me what you need." John pauses at the door, turns back. "I need you to let go. To stop trying to control everything, to accept that the Beatles aren't just your band, they're our band. But I don't think you can do that. I don't think you know how anymore, and I can't wait around hoping you'll figure it out." He opens the door, cold air rushing into the studio. "I'll finish Abbey Road with you. We owe the fans one more proper album, but after that, I'm out. Start thinking about what you want to do next, because it won't include me." John leaves. The door closes behind him with a heavy thud. Paul sits at the piano, alone except for Ringo, staring at nothing. After a long moment, he speaks without looking at Ringo. "Was he right? Have I really been that bad?" Ringo considers, then answers honestly. "Sometimes, yeah. You have good ideas, Paul, great ideas, but you push too hard. You don't leave room for the rest of us to breathe, to experiment, to fail. Everything has to be excellent on the first try, and that's exhausting." Paul nods slowly, absorbing this. "I thought I was helping. I thought I was saving us." "Maybe you were," Ringo says gently, "but you can't save something by controlling every aspect of it. Some things need to be allowed to fail or change or end. The Beatles might be one of those things." Paul looks up at Ringo, his face streaked with tears he's no longer bothering to hide. "I don't know who I am without the Beatles, without John. We've been partners for so long, longer than we haven't been partners. How do I just let that go?" "I don't know," Ringo admits, "but I think John's right about one thing. Something's broken, and maybe it can't be fixed. Maybe the best thing we can do is acknowledge that and move forward with dignity." Paul sits in silence for a long time after Ringo leaves. The studio is dark now, lit only by emergency exit signs casting a dim green glow. He thinks about everything John said, trying to find the lies in it, the exaggerations, the unfair accusations. But he can't. Deep down, he knows John is right. He has been controlling. He has been dominating. He justified it by telling himself he was saving the band, but maybe he was actually destroying it. He plays a few notes on the piano, the beginning of a melody that will eventually become "Let It Be." The irony isn't lost on him, a song about accepting things you can't change, written in a moment when he's realizing he's been unable to accept the natural evolution and eventual end of the thing he loved most. What John Lennon said when he told Paul McCartney he was ruining the band was brutal, honest, and ultimately accurate. He said that good intentions don't excuse bad behavior, that leadership without flexibility becomes tyranny, and that trying to preserve something by controlling it will destroy it just as surely as abandoning it. And what Paul heard, sitting alone in that dark studio, was the end of everything he'd built his identity around. The partnership was over. The Beatles were over, and he was the one who'd killed them, not through malice or negligence, but through loving them too much and too tightly, unable to let them breathe, unable to let them change, unable to let them go.